皆さんおはようございます。スタンドバイミーオンラインのマットです。皆さんと一緒に今日も元気よく相場を見ていきたいと思います。今日は FOMC のパウエル議長の会見に合わせてライブをいたします。同時配信で YouTube、ポストプライムというプラットフォームで両方やりますので、もしよろしかったら皆さん見ていってください。ではですね、早速どんな形になっているか見ていきますが、おそらくですね、今、あと10分、7分ほどですね、しましたら、相場の、パウエルさんの話が始まると思います。ただいまの時間はですね、2月2日木曜日4時23分ということで、皆さん朝早くからありがとうございます。さあ、眠い方もいらっしゃいますかね。頑張っていきましょう。ということで、相場の方を早速見ていきましょうね。パウエル議長の、状況が始まる前にちょっと環境認識していきたいと思います。よいしょ。はい、先物市場を見ていきます。先物市場じゃないですね。まだ空いてますもんね。失礼しました。いつもの癖で言ってしまいました。先物市場じゃなくて空いてます。ダウですね。マイナス 0.6、マイナス 0.96。そして S&P500 がマイナス 0.36。ナスダック総合がプラス 0.05。これ、あれですね。寄り付きの時と変わらないような感じですね。ダウの方が売り込まれて、ナスダックがプラスしているというところで、面白いですよね。これ本当に特徴的な相場ですよね。はい。ということでですね、今これちょっと週足見ちゃってるので、日足に戻します。はい。ちょっともうちょっと短い足にしましょうかね。皆さんこんばんは。朝早くからありがとうございます。たくさんの方が来てくださってます。びっくりしました。会見はまだ始まってないと思います。ちょっと設定がうまくできているかどうか心配なので、設定を見ながらやります。よいしょ。特にですね、パウエル議長の音声が始まった時にうまく見れているかどうかがちょっと心配なんですけど、ちょっとそこはですね、皆さんと一緒に、見ていきたいと思います。何か音が聞こえないとか、映像が乱れてしまうとか何かあったら教えてくださいね。これダウの5分足ですね。はい。ということです。はい、ちょっとですね、同時配信をしてるので、操作がちょっと遅いかもしれないんですけど、ご了承ください。おはようございます。たくさんの方が来てくださってますね。カリウドさん、太田さん、百獣のもさん、ボーノさん、おちこあんさん、マイフェアレディさん、M さん、静香さん、ヒロワイさん、ヒロトさん、くるみさん、ロングさん、ライオンさん、MRK さん、いくちゃんさん、ゴドナスビさん、マロさん、カリウドさん、ボーノさん、M さん、ヒロワイさん、ヒデさん、くるみさん、ロングさん、ライオンさん、MRK さん、はい、マロさん、トシさん、グッド、ハスビさんですかね。はい、すいません。ありがとうございます。YouTube の方もうまくできてるかちょっとわかりませんが、もし皆さんよろしかったらYouTube の方もですね、私の方の登録をフォローしていただいて、ライクしていただけると嬉しいです。じゃあちょっと、環境認識ですね。多分もうちょっとしたら始まると思いますので、それまでに環境認識ということで、2年債の利回りの方は横ばいですね。そして、10年債の利回りも横ばいということで、まあ、比 較的穏やかな状況が続いているようですね。そしてドル円、マイナス 0.33 ということで、まあ、こちらもそこまでじゃないというところですかね。はい。そんな状況の中ということで、まあ一番、動いてそうなのが、ダウがマイナス 0.79 売り込まれているという状況ですね。ここが一番大きいですかね。そして今日もちろん注目になるのが、あと1分後ぐらいに、パウエル議長が気にしているのが、こちらの、CPI の下落を受けて、そして ISM 製造業の景況感指数が57ポイント、ミシガン大学景況感指数もこちらも横ばいでかなり悪くなってきてます。そして失業率はある程度のところで止まっているという状況ですね。で、私の方がですね、ノートというのをやってまして、そちらでいつもプレゼント企画なんかやってます。で、いろんなノートっていうのはあるんですけど、今週なんかだと、この、タイトルはですね、加熱クライマックスっていうお話で、まとめています。相場の話ですね。いろんなニュース、まとめ、今週の映画はですね、ハウルの動く城ということで、こんな話をしてますが、あとは気になるニュースとかこういうのやった後にですね、私の方のマットズアイということで戦略の話とか、あとは企業研究ですね、やってます。で、経済指標もいろいろ出てますよね。で、ウォール・ストリート・ジャーナルの記事から抜粋したもの。これはですね、ノートのマガジンとに入っていただきますと、私の方でまとめた FOMC と株価の関係っていうのをですね、こちらの方をやってますので、ということで、はい。で、FOMC はなぜ世界の覇者なのかとかっていうのは、こういったところですかね。金利上がる変わる、金利下がる売られる。景気、金利上がる、資金借りにくくなる、景気悪化、株価、金利上がると資本コスト上昇で下落というで、これで、こういうお金を操作、為替金利を操作することによってお金に影響してお金が株価に影響するということで、世界の銀行と呼ばれている、フェット。これがですね、非常に大事になってくるということですね。さてどうでしょうか。始まりそうか。よいしょ。はい。ということで、世界の覇者、なぜ金利を動かしているのかっていうところがポイントになりますよね。で、偉い人たちがですね、集まってやると7人のアベンジャーズですね。7人のアベンジャーズが話し合って、先ほど言った世界の相場を動かしているというところで、これが偉い人アベンジャーズっていうことですね。この人たちがやった結果を、この真ん中の、白髪の初老の方が、すごくありがたいお話をしてくださるはずです。ちょっとライブが始まってるかどうかわかりませんが、ちょっとチラチラ見ながらすいませんね、不慣れで。そうですね、このアベンジャーズの人たちが、少しずつ人数を入れ替えながら、いろんないい話を聞かせてくれますというところですね。で、そのいいお話を聞かせてもらって、その代表の、その白髪の方が、何をおっしゃるのかと。で、ちょっと今、ナスダックの、5分足、始まってます。
Over the past year, we've taken forceful actions to tighten the stance of monetary policy. We've covered a lot of ground, and the full effects of our rapid tightening so far are yet to be felt. Even so, we have more work to do. Price stability is the responsibility of the Federal Reserve and serves as the bedrock of our economy. Without price stability, the economy does not work for anyone. In particular, without price stability, we will not achieve a sustained period of labor market conditions that benefit all. Today, the FOMC raised our policy interest rate by 25 basis points. We continue to anticipate that
コンセンサス通りの 0.25 ですね。
in order to attain a stance of monetary policy that is sufficiently restrictive to return inflation to 2% over time. In addition, we are continuing the process of significantly reducing the size of our balance sheet. Restoring price stability will likely require maintaining a restrictive stance for some time. I will have more to say about today's monetary policy actions after briefly reviewing economic developments. The U.S. economy slowed significantly last year, with real GDP rising at a below-trend pace of 1%. recent indicators point to modest growth of spending and production this quarter. Consumer spending appears to be expanding at a subdued pace, in part reflecting tighter financial conditions over the past year. Activity in the housing sector continues to weaken, largely reflecting higher mortgage rates. Higher interest rates and slower output growth also appear to be weighing on business fixed investment. Despite the slowdown in growth, the labor market remains extremely tight, with the unemployment rate at a 50-year low, job vacancies still very high, and wage growth elevated. Job gains have been robust, with employment rising by an average of 247,000 jobs per month over the last 3 months. Although the pace of job gains has slowed over the course of the past year and nominal wage growth has shown some signs of easing, the labor market continues to be out of balance. Labor demand substantially exceeds the supply of available workers, and the labor force participation rate has changed little from a year ago. Inflation remains well above our longer-run goal of 2%. Over the 12 months ending in December, total PCE prices rose 5.0%. Excluding the volatile food and energy categories, core PCE prices rose 4.4%. The inflation data received over the past 3 months show a welcome reduction in the monthly pace of increases. And while recent developments are encouraging, we will need substantially more evidence to be confident that inflation is on a sustained downward path. Despite elevated inflation, longer-term inflation expectations appear to remain well anchored, as reflected in a broad range of surveys of households, businesses, and forecasters, as well as measures from financial markets. But that's not grounds for complacency. Although inflation has moderated recently, it remains too high.
インフレは少し安らいでる、リラックス、イースドって言ってますよね。それが追加されたことが多いですよね。ただ、オンゴーイング、継続的な利上げが必要ということですね。なんで、なんてですかね、認めはするけど、非常に、まだ高いよって言ってますよね。動いてますね。
housing and transportation. We are highly attentive to the risks that inflation poses to both sides of our mandate, and we are strongly committed to returning inflation to our 2% objective. At today's meeting, the committee raised the target range for the federal funds rate by 25 basis points, bringing the target range to 4.5% to 4.75%. And we are continuing the process of significantly reducing the size of our balance sheet.
引き締めしまるって言ってますね、金融資産を。
We continue to anticipate that ongoing increases in the target range for the federal funds rate will be appropriate in order to attain a stance of monetary policy that is sufficiently restrictive to return inflation to 2% over time.
2% いくまで頑固としてやりますよって言ってますね。
In the most interest-sensitive sectors of the economy, particularly housing. It will take time, however, for the full effects of monetary restraint to be realized, especially on inflation. In light of the cumulative tightening of monetary policy and the lags with which monetary policy affects economic activity and inflation, the committee decided to raise interest rates by 25 basis points today, continuing the step down from last year's rapid pace of increases. Shifting to a slower pace will better allow the committee to assess the economy's progress toward our goals, as we determine the extent of future increases that will be required to attain a sufficiently restrictive stance. We will continue to make our decisions meeting by meeting, taking into account the totality of incoming data and their implications for the outlook for economic activity and inflation. We have been taking forceful steps to moderate demand so that it comes into better alignment with supply. Our overarching focus is using our tools to bring inflation back down to our 2% goal and to keep longer-term inflation expectations well anchored.
長く続けるって言ってますね。
Inflation is likely to require a period of below-trend growth and some softening of labor market conditions. Restoring price stability is essential to set the stage for achieving maximum employment and stable prices over the longer run.
いつもと同じこと言ってますね。2つ大事なことと物価の安定と雇用の安定ですね。
We will stay the course until the job is done. To conclude, we understand that our actions affect
雇用はもう達成したって言ってま
families
す
and
ね。
businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission. We at the Fed will do everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals.
すごいですね。ダンっていう言葉に反応しますね。面白いですね。今見るとこのダウンっていう言葉で一瞬で上がりましたね。ダウジョーンズの平均が 0.2% これをダウンっていう言葉で上がりましたね。
which has also brought down mortgage rates, and the stock market posted a solid gain in January. Does that make your job of combating inflation harder? And could you see lifting rates higher than you otherwise would to offset the increase in, or to offset the easing of financial conditions?
So it is important that overall financial conditions continue to reflect the policy restraint that we're putting in place in order to bring inflation down to 2%. And of course, financial conditions have tightened very significantly over the past year. I would say that our focus is not on short-term moves, but on sustained changes to broader financial conditions. And it is our judgment that we're not yet at a sufficiently restrictive policy stance, which is why we say that we expect ongoing hikes will be appropriate. Of course, many things affect financial conditions, not just our policy. And we will take into account overall financial conditions along with many other factors as we set policy.
Hi, Chair Powell. Thank you for taking our questions. Rachel Siegel from the Washington Post. Over the last quarter, we've seen a deceleration in prices, in wages, and a fall in consumer spending, all while the unemployment rate has been able to stay at a historic low. Does this at all change your view of how much the unemployment rate would need to go up, if at all, to see inflation come down to the levels you're looking for?
So I would say it is a good thing that the disinflation that we have seen so far has not come at the expense of a weaker labor market. But I would also say that disinflationary process that you now see underway is really at an early stage. What you see is really in the goods sector, you see inflation now coming down because supply chains have been fixed. Demand is shifting back to services, and shortages have been abated. So you see that in the housing services sector. We expect inflation to continue moving up for a while, but then to come down, assuming that new leases continue to be lower. So in those two sectors, you've got a good story. The issue is that we have a large sector called non-housing service, core non-housing services, where we don't see disinflation yet. But I would say that so far, what we see is progress, but without any
上
weakening.
がってますね。
Has your
Go ahead.
has your expectation for where the unemployment rate might go changed since December?
You know, we're going to write down new forecasts at the March meeting, and we'll see at that time. I will say that it is gratifying to see the disinflationary process now getting underway, and we continue to get strong labor market data. But you know, we'll update those forecasts in March.
Hi, Chair Powell. Neil Irwin with Axios. You and some of your colleagues have
ナスダックはプラス 0.82 まで上がってきましたね。
that would let some of the air out of the labor market without major job losses. We saw the opposite in the December jolts this morning. Job openings actually rising. That also has coincided with slowdown in wage inflation. Do you believe that openings are an important indicator to be studying to understand where the labor market is and where wage inflation might be heading?
So you're right about the data, of course. What we've seen average hourly earnings and now the employment cost index abating a little bit, still off of their highs of 6 months ago and more, but still at levels that are fairly elevated. The job openings number in JOLTS has been quite volatile recently, and I did see that it moved back up this morning. I do think that it's probably an important indicator. The ratio, I guess, is back up to 1.9 job openings to unemployed people who are looking for work. So it's an indicator, but nonetheless, you're right. We do see wages moving down. If you look across the rest of the labor market, you still see very high payroll job creation, and quits are still at an elevated level. So by many indicators, the job market is still very strong.
まだ賃金が高いっていうのしつこく言ってますね。やっぱ賃金ですよね。今回も賃金の高止まり。特にジョブスイッチャーって言われる転職者の人の、高いっていうことですよね。ただ安定はしてるって言ってますよね。
Trajectory for the Fed funds rate in the most recent SEP still the best guidepost for the policy path forward, or does ongoing now mean more than 2 rate rises now?
So you're right. At the December meeting, we all wrote down our best estimates of what we thought the ultimate level would be, and that's obviously back in December, and the median for that was between 5 and 5.25%. At the March meeting, we're going to update those assessments. We did not update them today. We did, however, continue to say that we believe ongoing rate hikes will be appropriate to attain a sufficiently restrictive stance of policy to bring inflation back down to 2%. We think we've covered a lot of ground, and financial conditions have certainly tightened. I would say we still think there's work to do there. We haven't made a decision on exactly where that will be. I think we're going to be looking carefully at the incoming data between now and the March meeting and then the May meeting. I don't
2月3月までに出てくる重要なデータを見てから考えるって言ってますね。とにかくオンゴーイングってところみんな引っかかってるみたいですね。
In the other direction, then we'll make data-dependent decisions at coming meetings, of course.
Just as a quick follow-up, how are you viewing the kind of balance of risk between those two options of, the likelihood of maybe falling short of that or going beyond that level?
I guess I would say it this way. I continue to think that it's very difficult to manage the risk of doing too little.
利下げのこと聞かれて困ってましたね。面白いですね。なんか正直な人ですね、この人ね。I manage って言ってましたもんね。なんとか対応するよって。でもすごく難しいって言ってますね。要は早めに、利下げをしなきゃいけないんですけど、利下げするっていうと株価が今ここから 4% ぐらい上がっちゃうんで、困っちゃうんですよね。4% この今映ってるナスダックが上がっちゃうと、皆さんまたインフレに走っちゃうので、テスラを買って、ボートを買って、旅行して、買い物しちゃうので、インフレになっちゃうんですね。なので、そこまではしたくないけど、すごく難しい。ただ、どっかで緩めないといけないんで、0.75 を突っ走るような、ブルドーザーみたいなことをアベンジャーズでやっちゃうとまずいんですよね。なので、ちょっとそこまではっていうところを、
nothing happening there. In the other two sectors, representing, less than 50%, you actually, I think, now have a story that is credible, that's coming together, although you don't actually see disinflation yet in housing services, but it's in the pipeline, right? So for the third sector, we don't see anything here. So I think it would be premature, it would be very premature to declare victory or to think that we've really got this. We need to see, our goal, of course, is to bring inflation down. And how do we get that done? There are many, many factors driving inflation in that sector, and they should be coming into play to have inflation, the disinflationary process begin in that sector. But so far, we don't see that. And I think until we do, we see ourselves as having a lot of work left to do.
Howard Schneider with Reuters, and thanks as usual. So I just wanted to connect a couple dots here. The statements made in
ロイターの方ですね。
that seem to be saying things are getting better. You're saying inflation has eased. That's new. You've taken out references to the war in Ukraine as causing price increases. You've taken out references to the pandemic. You've eliminated all the reasons that you said prices were being driven higher. Yet that's not mapping to any change in how you describe policy. We still have ongoing increases to come. So I'm wondering, why is that the case? And does it have more to do with uncertainty around the outlook, or more to do with you not wanting to give a very overeager market a reason to get ahead of itself and overreact?
So I guess I would say it this way. We can now say, I think, for the first time, that the disinflationary process has started. We can see that.
認めましたね。インフレが弱まってるのを認めましたね。
Goods prices is a big sector. This is what we thought would happen since the very beginning.
やばいな、これ上がってますよ。やばいっすよ、ナスダック。プラス 1.47% 上がってます。
So this is a good thing. This is a good thing. But that's you know,
グッ
around
ド
a
スイング、グッドスイング
quarter
って言ってますね。
PCE price index. So the second sector is housing services, and that's driven by very different things. And we, as I mentioned, with housing services, we expect, and other forecasters expect, that measured inflation will continue moving up for several months, but will then come down, assuming that new leases continue to be soft. And we do assume that. So we think that that's sort of in the pipeline. And we actually see disinflation in the goods sector, and we see it in the pipeline for two sectors that amount to a little less than half. So this is good, and we note that when we say inflation is coming down, that this is good. We expect to see that disinflation process.
住宅市場の落ち込みはやっぱりローンですよね。ローンと中古住宅が下がったっていうのは素晴らしいところですよね。
Core services ex housing sector that I talked
サ
about.
ービスセクターで
We
す
don't see
ね
it。yet. It's you know it's 7 or 8 different kinds of services. Not all of them are the same. And you know we have a sense of what's going
コア
on.
サービスの中でも7つの中でも違う動きになっているから、住宅が落ちてるのはいいけどって、とにかくもう、なんですかね。
Probably 60%.
全てじゃないって言ってるんですね。
You know, research would show is sensitive to slack in the economy, and so the labor market will probably be important. Some of the other ones, labor
労働市場って言ってますよね。賃金ですよね。
will drive it. In any case, we don't see disinflation in that sector yet, and I think we need to see that.
まだそこは賃金高止まりはディスインフレーションになってないから、ダメだよってみんな慌てないでって、まだ給料高いよ、時給高いよっ
It's
て
not that we're neither
言ってます
optimistic
ね。
nor pessimistic. We're just telling you that we don't see inflation moving down yet in that large sector. I think we will fairly soon, but we don't see it yet. Until we do, I think we see ourselves. We got to be honest with ourselves. We see ourselves as having perhaps more persistent. We'll see more persistent inflation in that sector, which will take longer to get down, and we're just going to have to. We have to complete the job. I mean, that's what we're here for.
Nick Timmeros, The Wall Street Journal. Chair Powell, you observed several years ago that we learned we can have a low unemployment rate without above target inflation, and we have learned lately that inflation can come down from its uncomfortably high level despite a historically low unemployment rate. Given that, and given how much you did over the last year, why do you think further rate increases are needed? Why not stop here and see what transpires in the coming months before raising rates again?
So we've raised rates 4.5 percentage points, and we're talking about a couple of more rate hikes to get to that level we think is appropriately restrictive. And why do we think that's probably necessary? We think because inflation is still running very hot. We're of course taking into account long and variable lags, and we're thinking about that. The story we're telling about inflation is to ourselves, and the way we understand it is basically the three things that I've just gone through a couple times. And again, we don't see it affecting the services sector ex housing yet. But I mean, I think our assessment is that we're not very far from that level. We don't know that though. We don't know that. So I think we're living in a world of significant uncertainty. I would look across the spectrum of rates and see that real rates are now positive, right by an appropriate set of measures are positive across the yield curve. I think policy is restrictive. We're trying to make a fine judgment about how much is restrictive enough. That's all. And we're going to, that's why we're slowing down to 25 basis points. We're going to be carefully watching the economy and watching inflation and watching the process.
ドル円が下がってますね。
You or your colleagues
ドルインデックスがですね、マイナス 0.81 ということで、やっぱり、すごく柔らかな、発言が多いので、
You'll see the minutes will come out.
ドルが弱まってますね。
We spent a lot of time talking about the path ahead and the state of the economy.
ドル円が130円台、ここに来てグイッと落ちましたね。こんな感じですね。
Hi, Chair Powell. I wanted to ask about the debt ceiling.
クリットも広がってるんですかね。ちょっとすいません。携帯で
The U.S. goes past the X date.
プライスを確認しますね。
Will the Fed do whatever the Treasury directs as it relates to making payments as the fiscal agent, or will it do its own analysis of any legal constraints?
So your question is, would we say your question again?
Will the Fed do what Treasury directs as it relates to making payments, or will it do its own analysis of any legal constraints?
So you're really asking about, you're asking about prioritization in effect, is what
Yes,
you're, okay.
yes.
So I feel like I have to say this. There's only one way forward here, and that is for Congress to raise the debt ceiling so that the United States government can pay all of its obligations when due. And any deviations from that path would be highly risky, and that no one should assume that the Fed can protect the economy from the consequences of failing to act in a timely manner. In terms of our relationship with the Treasury, we are their fiscal agent, and I'm just going to leave it at that.
Are you actively doing any planning of what might happen in the event that would happen?
I'm just going to leave it at that. This is a matter that's to be resolved between it's really Congress's job to raise the debt ceiling, and I gather there are discussions happening, but they don't involve us. We're not involved in those discussions, so we're the fiscal agent.
そうですね、ドル円もそうですね、130円手前ぐらいだったんですかね。だいぶ落ちてきましたね。まだ落ちてますね。スプレッドが広いので皆さん、為替気をつけてくださいね。かなり広がってますね。
So, the committee, obviously, did not see this as a time to pause. We judged that the appropriate, thing to do at this meeting was to raise the federal funds rate by 25 basis points, and we said that we continue to anticipate that ongoing increases
皆さんおはようございます。
in order to attain that
下の方が見えてますね。
restrictive monetary policy that will bring inflation down to 2%. So that's the judgment that we made. We're gonna write down new forecasts in March, and we'll certainly be looking at the incoming data as everyone else will.
Sorry, I should have been clear. I mean, would it be possible to take a meeting off, for example, and then resume? Could you, rather than just doing at every meeting a move, go a little bit more slowly, take some gaps in between moves?
I mean, I think this is not something that the committee is thinking about or exploring in any kind of detail. In principle, though, we used to do was go every other meeting. If you remember, 25 basis points, and that was considered a fast pace. So, I think a lot of options are available, and you saw what the Bank of Canada did, and they left it that they're willing to raise rates after pausing. But this is not something that the Federal Open Market Committee is on the point of deciding right now.
Steve Leisman, CNBC. Mr. Chairman, the SEP has the PCE inflation rate in 2023 at 3.1%. Meanwhile, the 3-month annualized PCE is 2.1%, and you've achieved this without going to your 5.1% funds rate, which is what you have penciled in for.
ズバリ聞いてますね。
And you've also achieved
もう 5.1% CPI 落ちてるんだからやる必要ないんじゃないって言ってますね。
penciled in for this year. I'm wondering if you've considered the idea of whether or not your understanding of the inflation dynamic may be wrong, and it's possible to achieve these things without raising rates that high, and also without the surge in unemployment. And specifically, I wonder if you might comment on the speech given by Vice Chair Lael Brainerd, who said, to the extent that inputs other than wages may have been responsible in part for important price increases for some non-housing services, an unwinding of these factors. In other words, it may not be wages. The idea that it may not require unemployment rising to get this sector of inflation under control. Thanks.
失業率を待たなくてもいいんじゃないかって言ってますよね。
You're right. If you take very short-term, three-month, say, measures of
3ヶ月の短い期間で言ったらそうかもしれないけどって言ってますね。
That's because that's driven by significantly negative readings from goods inflation. Most forecasters and
ものすごい速度で下落してること自体はいいって言ってますよね。重要な。
And that goods inflation will move up fairly soon back up to its longer run trend of something around zero, something like that. So a lot of forecasts would call for core PCE to go back up to 4% by the middle of the year, for example. So that's really where the sustainable level is more like at 4%. So that would suggest there's work left to do. Let's say inflation does come down much faster than we expect, which is possible.
認めましたね。自分たちが思うよりもずっと早く落ちてるって。ようやく認めましたね。
In terms of the core non-housing services, as I mentioned earlier, it's a very diverse sector, 6 or 7 sectors.
これナスダックの1分足ですね。
So sectors that represent 55 or
プラス
60%
1.37 上がってますね。
subsectors of that sector we think are sensitive to slack in the economy, sensitive to the labor market in a way. But some of the other sectors are not. And for example, financial services is a big sector. That's really not
4時間足ですね。
by labor markets, wages. So that's why I said there are a number of things that will affect. Take restaurants, right? So clearly labor is important for restaurants, but so are food prices. And transportation services is going to be driven by fuel prices, for example. So there are lots of things in that mix that will drive inflation. I would say overall, though, my own view would be that you're not going to have a sustainable return to 2% inflation in that sector without a better balance in the labor market. And I don't know what that will require in terms of increased unemployment, your question. I do think there are a number of dimensions through which the labor market can soften. And so far, we've got, as I mentioned, in goods, we have inflation moving down without the softening in the labor market. I think most forecasters would say that unemployment will probably rise a bit from here, but I continue to think that there's
重要なポイント来ましたね、皆さ
getting
ん。
inflation back down to 2% without a really significant economic decline or a significant increase in unemployment. And that's because the setting we're in is quite different. The inflation that we originally got was very much a collision between very strong demand and hard supply constraints, not something that you really have seen in prior business cycles. And so now we see goods inflation coming down for the reasons we thought, and we understand why housing inflation will come down. And I think a story will emerge on the non-housing services sector soon enough. But I think there's ongoing disinflation, and we don't yet see weakening in the labor market. So we'll have to see.
まだ労働市場はそこまで CPI ほどは急激には落ちないから見なきゃいけないっていう言い方をしてるんで、やっぱり最後の砦なんでしょうね。そこが怖いんで、正直、maybe って言ってますよね。弱って感じですよね。
But that's not my base case. My base case is that the economy can return to 2% inflation without a really significant downturn or a really big increase in unemployment. I think that's a possible outcome. I think many forecasters would say it's not the most likely outcome, but I would say there's a chance of it.
なるほど。これから出てくるものが全てそうなるかわからないけど、possible とかまあね、maybe とか使い始めましたね。
Full weight of your tightening not in place yet, and with the progress against inflation, there's still a lot of talk about very, very slow growth going forward in 2023, and the recession indicators are all suggesting that we are going to see recession this year. So I'm wondering if you've changed your view or you have a more nuanced view of what you think
リセッション懸念のビュー、考え方を聞いてますね。
whether you're very close to perhaps tipping it into the wrong place, which calls for more restraint on your part.
So I do think most forecasts and my own assessment would be that growth will continue, positive growth will continue, but at a subdued pace.
GDP とか上がってますからね。良くなってるからって。
Last year, and also final sales growth, which we think is a better indicator of about 1%. I think most forecasts and certainly my assessment would be that growth will continue at a fairly subdued level this year. There are other factors, though, that need to be considered. You will have seen that the global picture is improving a bit, and that will matter for us.
IMF のあれですね、世界の見通しの GDP が良くなったってことを言ってますね。
That's job creation, that's wages. As inflation does come down,
だから絶対リセッションっていう言葉は使わないんですね、彼はね。まあアベンジャーズのサノスみたいな立場なので、そのリセッションっていうとこう叩いちゃうことになるんでしょうね。
both private and public, and so that's going to support economic activity. So I think there's a good chance that those factors will help support positive growth this year. And that's my base case is that there will be positive growth this year.
Thank you. Rich Miller from Bloomberg. First of all, how are you doing?
Fine, thanks. Fine.
Good. Second off, I think earlier on in the press conference, you said you need to see substantially more evidence of inflation coming down. Can you give us some idea of what you're thinking of? You mentioned 3 months, that we've seen 3 months in a row. Governor Waller suggested he might want to see 6 months. Is it just the inflation data, or do you have to see the labor market coming back into better balance to have that substantially more evidence?
So I don't think there's going to be a light switch flipped or anything like that. I think it's just an accumulation of evidence. So of course we'll be looking, by the time of the March meeting, we'll have 2 more employment reports, 2 more CPI reports, and we'll be looking at those carefully, as all of us will, and we'll be asking ourselves, what are they telling us? And soon after that, we'll have another ECI wage report, which, as you know, is a report that we.
今週末雇用統計出るんですよ。その前に ECI のウェッジですね。賃金のやつが出たんですけど、その話をしますね。で、若干下がってくれたんですよね。それグッドポイントなんですよね。素晴らしいですね。パンデミック前まで戻ったっていうことで。
It's going to be reflected in our assessment of the outlook, and that will be reflected in our policy over time. But I will say, though, it is our job to restore price stability and achieve 2% inflation for the benefit of the American public.
12% いくまでは私たちの仕事としてはやめれないんだっていうエクスキューズを一生懸命してますね。それしか言えないんでしょうね。
But in one form or another. But we have to deliver that, and so we are strongly resolved that we will, complete this task because we think it has benefits that will, support economic activity and benefit the public for many, many years.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Fed Chairman, for taking the questions. So you've talked about we had solid job growth. We had solid job growth, a slight falling in the increase in consumer spending. It seems so far it's been relatively mild from the economy to go from a 9.1% CPI inflation to 6.5% CPI inflation. Is the hard part yet to come, to go from 6.5 to 2?
I don't think we know, honestly. So we, of course, expected goods inflation to start coming down by the end of 2021. And it didn't. It didn't come down all through 22. And now it's coming down, and it's coming down pretty fast. So I would say this is not a standard business cycle where you can look at the last 10 times there was a global pandemic and we shut the economy down and Congress did what it did and we did what we did. It's unique. So I think certainty is just not appropriate here. Inflation, it's just harder to forecast inflation. It may come down faster. It may take longer to come down. And, our job is to deliver inflation back to target, and we will do that. But I think we're going to be cautious about declaring victory and, sending signals that we think that the game is won. Because
やっぱり慎重にこの急激に落ちているインフレとかっていうのを見ていかないといけないっていうのを言ってますね。新しいステージには移ってるって言ってますもんね。バーッとって言ってますもんね。It's going to take some time. That's all wrong. Do you know? See.
My forecast and that of my colleagues, as you will see from the SEP, and there are many different forecasts, but generally it's a forecast of slower growth, some softening in labor market conditions, and inflation moving down steadily, but not quickly. And in that case, if the economy performs broadly in line with those expectations, it will not be appropriate to cut rates this year, to loosen policy this year. Of course, other people have forecasts with inflation coming down much faster. That's a different thing. If that happens, if inflation comes down much faster, then we'll be seeing that, and it will be incorporated.
ということですね。インフレの方はもう早く、much faster って言ってますもんね。だけど、やっぱり賃金、労働環境はゆっくり。もっと、much more quickly って言ってますね。今見るとですね、やられてるのはダウジョーンズの方が少しやられてますかね。エネルギー関係ですね。昨年優秀だったエネルギー関係、あとは防衛、キャタピラー、マクドナルド、UPS、アムジェンとかバイオ、イーラ・ライリーとか、ヘルスケアテック、シェブロン、エクソンモービル、あとはパイオニアナチュラルリソースとかオキシデンタルペトロリアムとか、この辺が全部やられているということで、まあ、高配当でエネルギー関係がやられてますという状況です。で、逆に、綺麗なところを、目に優しい綺麗なところを見ていきますと、テックですね。NVIDIA プラス 6.8%、ワオですね。ワオ上がりですね。これすごいですね。そしてテスラがプラス 3.84%。で、メタ、プラス 2.2%。オラクル、プラス 2.0%。いやー、すごいな。アドービーがプラス 0.358%。セールスフォースがプラス 2.4%。はい。ということで、皆さん、昨年、マイナス30%からマイナス70%近く、60% 近くで落ちた銘柄が買われているという状況ですね。さあ、どうでしょうか、ここから。もう、相場終わったんですかね。止まりましたかね。ちょっと見てみましょう。まだ動いてますね。すいません、失礼しました。ナスダックがプラス 2.19 ですね。S&P500 がプラス 1.29。そしてラッセルがプラス 1.69。そして、パング指数がプラス 3.54 ということですね。で、ソックス、半導体関係ですね。インテル、AMD とか、ALM とか、ASML とか、東京エレクトロンデバイス、レーザーテック、スクリーン、信越科学、まあそういったところが 4.36 ぐらいということで、すごいですね。はい。コモディティ見てみましょうか。コモディティはですね、マイナス 2.26 ということで、コモディティ指数は下がってきてますね。ますね。WTI も同じですね。マイナス 2.62 ということで、原油が下がってきてますね。シルバーだけ元気ですね。プラス 0.89 ということで、跳ねてます。皆さん大好き天然ガスがマイナス 7.0 ということで、ちょっともう天然ガスは、底がまだ抜けて、樽の底がジャブジャブ流れてる状況ですね。ショートかけてる方はすごいですね、これ。で、ゴールド。プラス 0.70 ということで上がっています。ただしまあこれ、下髭もつき始めましたね。今これ15分足で見てます。
They're glad that inflation is coming down. People really don't like inflation. And as we see it coming down, that could also add a boost to economic activity. You look at the sentiment surveys now, and they're very, very low. With 3.5% unemployment and, high wage increases nominally by historical standards, why can that be? It has to be inflation, right? So I think once inflation is seen to be coming down in coming months, even you will also see a boost to sentiment, I hope.
Most closely is consumer expectations.
That's at the very heart. It's consumers and businesses. Essentially, we believe that expectations of future inflation are a very important part of the process of creating inflation. That's a sort of a bedrock belief. In one way or another, it has to be. We think it's important. And in this case, I would say the risk 8 months ago or so, longer-term inflation expectations had moved up. We moved quite vigorously last year. Expectations are seem to be well anchored, including at the shorter end now, not just the longer end. So it's, and I think that's very reassuring. I think, the markets have decided and the public has decided that inflation is going to come back down to 2%, and it's just a matter of us following through. That's immeasurably helpful to the process of getting inflation down. The fact that people now do generally believe that it will come down, that'll be part of the process of getting it down, and it's a very positive thing.
Thank you, Chair Powell. Greg Robb from Market Watch. In the minutes of the December meeting, there was a couple sentences that struck people as important. When the committee said participants talked about this unwarranted easing of financial conditions was a risk, and it would make your life harder to bring inflation down. I haven't heard you talk
皆さんありがとうございます。たくさんの方が来てくださってますね。
Has that concern eased among members, or is that still something you're concerned about?
I would put it this way, it's something that we monitor carefully.
ありがとうございます。いつも朝早くからびっくりしました。こんなにたくさんの方が来てくださるとは思ってなかったので、私はあまりちょっと声も出て、声が出てないので、すいません。パウエルさんの声を聞いてください。
As we've discussed a couple times here, there's a difference in perspective by some market measures on how fast inflation will come down. We're just going to have to see. I'm not going to try to persuade people to have a different forecast. But our forecast is that it will take some time and some patience, and that we'll need to keep rates higher for longer. But we'll see.
Hi, Chair Powell. Brendan Peterson with Punchbowl News. I wanted to ask if the Fed takes into account at all the debt ceiling when it comes to quantitative tightening, given the fact that rapid or faster quantitative tightening could bring us closer faster to that drop.
いつ回収するんだって言ってますよね。
Look, it's very hard to think about all the different possible ramifications, and I think the answer is basically I don't think there's likely to be any important interaction between the two, because I believe Congress will wind up acting, and as it will and must in the end, to raise the debt ceiling in a way that doesn't risk, the progress we're making against inflation and the economy and the.
今サノスさんが話してます。
I believe it will happen. We of course will monitor money market conditions carefully, as the process moves on. For example, the Treasury General account will shrink down and then it will grow back up, and we understand there'll be lots of flows between there and the overnight repo facility and reserves. We understand all that. We're watching it carefully. We'll just be monitoring it. Thank you very much.
終わりましたね。皆さんお疲れ様でした。S&P500 の、ボラティリティ指数がマイナス 2.61 ということですごいですね。かなり下がりましたね。一時はですね、20% 台まで行ってたんですよね。20% まで回復したんですけど、ここがですね、よいしょ。今、上髭つけてますけど、やっぱりかなり変わってきましたね。はい。20% 台超えたんですけど、今下がってきたということで、はい、ありがとうございました。ということで、中継が終わったので、最後、皆さんじゃあおさらいをして終わりたいと思います。たくさんの方ありがとうございます。たくさんの方が来てくださってますね。じゃあちょっとチャート、よいしょ。ということでですね、フェットとは戦ってはいけないという格言があります。Don't fight Fed っていう言葉があるんですけど、我々個人投資家はですね、ルールベースの投資っていうので、基本に忠実というのを守っていくのがいいと思います。今日見ていただいてわかると思うんですけど、マイナスの 0.6 ポイントぐらいからプラスの2ポイントぐらいまで上がるということで指数ですね。なので指数が 3% 近く動く日なので、かなり、なんですかね、その最中っていうのは動きます。なので、スキャルピングの方はかなり、取れたとは思うんですよね。例えば、ドル円なんかもですね、こういった形で、急激な、下げですよね。下げの、チャートになりますね。で、ここを取っていくって方ももちろんいらっしゃいますし、このイベントまたぎっていうのを、あえて避けるっていう方もいますよね。なので、 やり方はいろいろあるとは思うんですけど、いろいろ考えると、リスクをある程度、避けるっていう方は多分、ポジションを持たずにということで、今これドル円でたまたま見てるからお伝えするんですけど、やっぱり、サプライズに備えてっていうのと、あとショートポジションを取るために一旦上がるんですよね。買わなきゃいけないので、一旦買って、上髭で、利回りが、ターゲットレートがですね、0.25 が決まってしまえば、そこからドーンと落ちて、で、ここで揉み合いながら、パウエルさんの発言ですよね。発言を聞いて、まだオンゴーイングって言ってると、続けるよって言うと上に行きたいってなるんですけど、上に行きたいところから、いつダーンとか、明らかに、自分たちが、アンティシペートとか、エクスペクテッドとは予想したよりも下がってしまう CPI を見たので、マッチファースターっていう言葉を言うと、マッチファースター、ダーンとか、いつダーンとか、そういう言葉が、ポジティブな言葉が起きると、下へと動かされるっていう感じですよね。で、先ほどちょっと見ながら見たんですけど、スプレッドっていう為替なんかで言うと、その時の取引の、差益っていうんですかね、そちらがすごく大きくなるので、結構巻き込まれると、ここで持ってかれるっていう、この上髭、下髭とか、騙しが入って持ってかれたりとかしますので、気をつけていただいてというのが為替ですかね。で、これまさに行ってこい相場っていうやつで、ちょっと私もこの中継が終わった後自分の、ようやく FX の方のポジションというか、もう一回、再エントリーポイントっていうのは考えてはいきますね。で、S&P500 とかナスダックとか米国市場に関してはですね、おさらいすると同じくですね、オンゴーイングっていうと逆に今度、赤ですね、赤の陰線をつけて、ダメなんかいって続けるんかいっていうので、下がるんですけど、その後、ポジティブな先ほど言った言葉ですよね。インフレは下がっていくのは認めたよとか、労働市場は、緩やかに、その ECI っていう、先行指標ですね。今週末、労働、雇用統計出るんですけど、その先行指標の方がグッドが出たので、結構悪くないねっていうことですね。で、あとは言ってたのは IMF の世界見通しがですね、23年の実質成長率が 2.9 ということで、プラス 0.2% 上がったんですね。このプラスポイントっていうのを見て、世界も悪くないよね、とか、全米の GDP もですね、市場を上回って、ソフトランディングに行けるんじゃないか。リセッション懸念って聞かれても、リセッションって言葉は絶対使わないんですけど、非常に、悪い状況ではないっていう言い方をしてました。あとは PCE ですね。個人消費がプラス 4.4% で、これも多分リセッション懸念は今回は、前回の2009年のリーマンショックのようなことはなさそうだってことを多分言いたいんでしょうね。で、民間雇用統計ですね。サービス会社の ADP が、発行しているものも良かったですね。プラス10万人、10.6 万人ということで、予想は17万人だったんですけど、民間雇用が少し抑えられたっていうことは、失業率も若干落ちますし、一番加熱気味だったのが労働者の市場だったんですよね。賃金が上がりすぎ、人不足、みんな戻ってこない、これが非常に困った状況だったんですけど、ようやく労働、状況、が、高止まってくれたのかなと。ジョブスイッチャーとかっていつも私がお見せしているジョブスイッチャーなんていうのがもう非常に本当に大事でして、そちらの、状況が、改善されたんじゃないかっていうことで、ちょっと言ってるっていうことですね。この辺ですかね。雇用者の方の推移が、落ち着いてきたらということで、これ BLS っていうところで見れるんですが、そしてドットプロットの方が、これは更新されてるのかな。5.1 っていうターゲットのレートがあったんですけど、それがどこまでいったかなというところですかね。はい。ということで、これは、いつもお見せしてるやつですよね。昨日の夜はですね、99.9 ポイントということで、で、多分3月ですね、3月の FOMC でこの、青く、見えますかね。青くこの点々点々ってなってるのが、アベンジャーズの FOMC のメンバー7人が ドットプロットを置くんですけど、その人たちの、ところが、この 5.1 ってところなんですけど、今は変更ないんですけど、3月の FOMC でどうなるかっていうのがポイントですね。それをみんな聞き出したかったんですよね。要は、気持ちを変わったんですかとか、認めますかとか、そういうことを言ってると。オーバーキルっていう言い方をですね、私のプライム登録の方にはですね、昨年の、10月の末ぐらいから11月にかけてもう伝えてます。今日のこのパウエルさんの発言がいつ出るかっていうのがポイントで、もう11月の頭ですね、ぐらいには、もうすでにもう決まってたんですね。11月の頭ですでにもうやりすぎてたっていうのは決まってたので、そこを見据えて、株の仕込みをするというところですかね。なので、今から3ヶ月、4ヶ月前ぐらいに仕込んだ方が、ある意味しっかり、なんていうんですかね、リターンを得れたということになりますよね。なので、その辺がですね、すごく、これファンダメンタル分析っていうやつですね。皆さんご存知だと思うんですけど、テクニカルは聞かない話なので、彼はサノスなので、サノスの指鳴らしは誰もわからないので、いつどうやって指鳴らすかっていうのはわからないので、その辺はですね、指鳴らしの、鳴らしたいんだけど鳴らせないっていうその雰囲気を察知するみたいな、そういうところが、マクロの戦略では絶対必要になるということですよね。はい。なんでこれナスダックの、これ先物なんでちょっと、まだ空いてるんでナスダック見ますが、こういった形ですね。そうですね。私の方が先ほど言ったようにオーバーキルっていうその今回のような発言がおそらく出さなきゃいけないだろうっていうのが分かったのが、数字的に分かったのがですね、ここですね。ここのタイミングですね。11月のこのタイミングで分かってというところで、私の方の、チャンネルの方と一緒にお話ししたのは、このあたりでお話ししてます。このあたりで、多分もう認めざるを得ないところに来ちゃったねって、数字的にはですね、数字的にはそういう織り込みが始まったということで、この辺で、しっかりと、気づいた方は、私の場合はちょっと戦略としては多分まだジグザグしたり、あとはクリスマスラリーっていうのがですね、サンタラリーが早くに終わるっていうのも分かっていたので、早めに抜けて一旦利確とかっていうのをしながらやってるっていう状況ですね。なので、12月の16日ぐらいですかね。この12月の27から28にかけて、ここがポイントだったっていうことですかね。ということで皆さんありがとうございました。長い時間かかってしまいましたね。思ったより長かったですね。約1時間お付き合いいただき、誠にありがとうございました。皆さんいかがだったでしょうか。もうお仕事行かれる方、家事をしている方、たくさんお忙しかったと思うんですけど、ありがとうございます。ではですね、これで皆さんと、1時間も長くやってしまったので終わりたいと思います。もしよろしければですね、私の方、すいません、宣伝で恐縮なんですけど、ワンコイン500円で、プライム登録でこういった話ですね、この、今日見たような、いろんな話、あとはノートを使った、皆さんに、先ほどお伝えしたような、なんで11月のその頭にそういう話ができたかとかっていう、そのエビデンスとか、グラフ、チャート、数字、時給のフローとか私はすごく気にするので、その時給のフローに関してお伝えしながら皆さんと、うまくマクロのトレンドに逆らわないで、フェットに戦わないで、一番美味しいところのトレンドだけを、年に何回かを狙って取って、あとは長期投資、中期投資、短期投資で、為替とか、コモディティ、あとは仮想通貨なんか、あとは債券ですかね。そういうところもしっかりトレンドの転換を、皆さんと学びながら、しっかり入っていくと。そういうところで楽しんでいきたいということで、こういった、ノートを使ってやってますので、もしよろしければですね、こちらの方もですね、メンバーシップっていうのをやってまして、そちらに入っていただければ、バックナンバー、企業研究なんかもやってますので、その企業研究で、お見せした、内容なんかが全部見れますので、よろしければ見てってください。ということで、皆さんありがとうございました。たくさんの方が。ではですね、これで終わりたいと思います。じゃあ皆さん、朝早くから ありがとうございました。二度寝する方は、はい、すぐベッドに入ってください。てかもう、ベッドに入りながら見てるのかなわかんないんですけど。ありがとうございました。じゃあ、YouTube の方もありがとうございました。たくさんの方が YouTube 見てくださって、僕もびっくりしてます。同時中継うまくいったんでしょうか？ちょっと、後で見直します。操作がうまくできなかったかもしれないんですが、はい。ということで、またお会いしましょう。Have a good time!